first Giza Death Star webinar, and I'm calling this the juridical theological doctrine of the corporate person and its implications, with a little subtitle, a study in application of the topological metaphor of the medium. Now, I'm new to all of this, so it's going to be a little rough, but I want to start here. I've divided this little outline, this little presentation, into 4 parts. The first part, I'm going to make some introductory remarks by way of some general cultural observations. Then in section 2, I'm going to point out a very crucial point, and this more than anything else, I want you to take away with you. Personhood itself is a no thing, all right? And we're going to see why as this talk proceeds. The third point I'm going to talk about is the doctrine of original sin as it's taught in the Western Church, and the idea of an inherited moral and juridical culpability. Now, I've covered a lot of this in Financial Vipers of Venice, and I'll be reviewing what I said in that book quite extensively in these remarks, but I'm going to be adding some things that are very, very crucial for you to understand by way of how the medieval period viewed this development, particularly in terms of its understanding of emerging constitutional law, as we would call it today. And then in the fourth and final part of this talk, I'm going to talk about the consequences of all of this. So let's get started. We are on the very first point in our outline. And again, I have 3 points I want to talk about here. The first is a kind of a general and cultural history of the West. The second is what I'm going to call a theological Rorschach inkblot test, by way of illustrating what I'm going to be talking about in the first part, the general and cultural history. And then the third point I'm going to make in terms of this cultural history is corporate personhood. Now, I don't have any prepared remarks for this particular part of the talk, so I'm doing this extempore. Now, as far as the general cultural history of the West goes, we know that Christianity has had a huge influence on the West, and to such an extent that its effects are present even in the thinking of those who don't subscribe to any organized religion, certainly not to Christianity. And it's present in such a way that most people are scarcely aware of how radical and all-pervasive this influence is. And this is certainly true of the doctrine of the corporate personhood. So I want to give you what I used to do with my theology students. I call it a theological Rorschach inkblot test. Now, we all know what a Rorschach inkblot is. A psychologist would hold up a picture of an inkblot, and people, without reflecting or without thinking about it, were to tell them what they thought the picture or the inkblot was. And this was supposed to reveal something about a person's personality and assumptions. Well, my little theological Rorschach inkblot test is designed not to reveal a person or their personality, but rather the cultural influences on them that they may not have ever thought about. So my theological Rorschach inkblot test consists of me asking a question and you giving an answer without really pausing to reflect or think about it. Now, the inkblot test in this case consists of a very simple question. When you think of Adam and Eve, do you tend to think of them subconsciously, without reflection, as adults or children? Now, that may seem an unusual question, but if you stop and think about it, most people that you ask in the West are going to answer adults. And that's part of a deep cultural heritage that Western Christianity has. If you go to the East, you'll tend to get the same answer, but more people will say, well, maybe they were children, or I tend to think of them as children. And the reason for this cultural presence, even in people that aren't necessarily religious, if you ask them that question, they'll probably give you that answer. And the reason for it is that the theological formulations of the West ultimately owe a great deal to a famous Latin church father by the name of Augustine of Hippo. You know him as St. Augustine. And when Augustine looked at Adam and Eve and the fall of man, he tended to view Adam and Eve not as being created in a state of goodness, but rather in a state of perfection. In other words, they were created as full-grown human beings, full-grown adults. And additionally, the implication was that they had kind of perfect spiritual knowledge. If you look, on the other hand, at some of the earlier church fathers, both East and West, you get this idea that Adam and Eve were created in a state of innocence. And in that time frame, innocence kind of meant child or childishness or childlike character. So in other words, they were created good, but not necessarily perfect. So when they fell, they didn't fall quite as far, you see. And with Augustine, you have the idea of adults of perfection. So when they fell much further. Now, this has a huge, huge implication, as we're going to see, for the doctrine of corporate personhood. But corporate personhood, as we all know, is one of those features of Western Christianity that has had a huge and signal significance and implication for the development of Western culture, because the doctrine of a corporation as a legal person, as a persona ficta in law, originates within the Middle Ages for very precise reasons, deeply rooted in theology. And for those of you who've read Financial Vipers of Venice, you'll know what some of those reasons are, but you may not know what some of the implications are. So let's pass on to our next slide and talk about the various attempts that have been made to define personhood. What does it mean when you say I'm a person, or she's a person, or he's a person? What does that mean? Well, again, typical in the West, there are various subconscious responses to this. And the first is, believe it or not, one that is not a formula that any church father would have ever accepted. But again, for deep cultural theological reasons, most people in the West will equate the soul, the human soul, with the person. Now, that's a very interesting formulation, because if you look at the second point up here, what the soul traditionally or classically means in philosophy and theology and so on, is the soul is the entity in which our natural, rational faculties co-inhere. So in other words, the soul represents our functions of mind, our functions of will, our emotions, and our memory. So in other words, the soul equals person means that the person is being defined in terms, and please follow me here, the person is being defined in terms of their natural operations of mind, intellect, will, emotions, memory, and certainly virtue. That's another thing that we have to add to this list. Now, in jurisprudence, this has a very significant implication, as we're going to see, because you're going to see that corporations are defined as persons precisely because they perform certain of the natural functions. They're chartered to perform a certain limited set of functions that are proper to the human soul. All right. Now let's look at this fourth point up here, the via negativa. That means the negative way. In Greek, it's called apophasis or apophasis, the apophatic way. And this is the way of defining things by defining what they are not. Now, this is very, very important, because as we're going to see, ultimately, personhood and even human nature are defined apophatically. They're defined negatively. And the reason for this is quite important. If you've been following all that we've been talking about, the topological metaphor, that primordial nothing in which there begins to be differentiation into differentiated nothings. Well, that no thing is defined negatively because it's not any analogical category. that you can apply to it. It's not infinitude, it's not finitude, it's not spirit, it's not matter. It exists prior to any category of definition whatsoever. So in other words, it can only be defined negatively. That isn't to say, if you've been paying attention, that it doesn't have positive analogical qualifications or attributes, all right? But what it is meaning is you can never come to a complete definition of all the functions proper to the set of functions within that primordial nothing, all right? So in other words, personhood, if you've been following what I've said, personhood, when we get right down to it, does consist and is related to a set of functions, but any attempt to define precisely what those functions are ultimately reduces it. So in other words, personhood exceeds the sum total of any functional set definition of it, all right? And ultimately, we're going to see that the same thing holds true of human nature and, in fact, of any nature. So in other words, we arrive at personhood as being yet another example of that empty hyperset within the topological metaphor. And as you'll recall, Dr. DeHart and I hinted at this in our little book, Yahweh, the Two-Faced God, because there's two ways you can take that metaphor, and one of them now is personhood is the empty hyperset. All right. Now that has huge implications right there, because we've been talking all along about how the physical medium and consciousness seem to be inextricably related. Well, if that be the case, that personhood might be the empty hyperset, then obviously it's related to functions of mind, will, emotions, and memory, just so long as you realize that those things, or the sum total of them, never define or circumscribe the total content of personhood. So now with those qualifications in mind, let's go on to our next slide. I want to review at some length what I wrote about the doctrine of original sin and its relationship to corporate personhood in the Financial Vipers of Venice on pages 146 through 153. And I'm going to read this whole section to you because I'm going to be adding things now from the Middle Ages, and specifically from jurists. And by jurists in the Middle Ages, we have to understand we're not dealing simply with lawyers, but we're also dealing with theologians. The two things overlap a great deal. But here's what I said in Financial Vipers of Venice, beginning on page 146. Quote, "The theological part of this story begins with the mistranslation made by St. Jerome in the Latin Vulgate, and with how St. Augustine of Hippo Regius, on the basis of that mistranslation, formulated the Western Church's doctrine of original sin. But first, some caveats. The first caveat is this: to attempt to survey the vast amount of literature and subtlety that can be written about the doctrine of corporate personhood as an adjunct of the Western Church's doctrine of original sin in a few mere pages in a chapter is an impossibility. Whole tomes have been written about the subject, and all that can be accomplished here is to show the basic theological concepts, their roots, interconnections, and a few of the sweeping implications of that doctrine for the formation of Western culture, jurisprudence, and finance." And skipping to the next slide, the second caveat flows from those previously mentioned roots, interconnections, and sweeping implications. For the doctrine, as the Western Church came to hold it in one form or another and to varying degrees of severity, was precisely a Western doctrine, unique to the medieval Latin Church, and therefore, in its conceptual roots, unique to the Protestant churches that broke from it. It was not and is not the doctrine of the Eastern Orthodox churches, which do not even refer to the doctrine as original sin, but properly speaking as the ancestral sin, unquote. Now I want to break my quotation here to draw your attention to an obvious fact, but one I hope that will become stunningly huge with significance for you by pointing it out. Because what we're seeing emerge with this precise doctrine is a distinctly Western versus a distinctly Eastern European culture, because both of these things are now in the making. And as a result of this, they're going to give rise to very different understandings of how the body politic and its constitutions are organized. Note that the influence of this doctrine will affect all Western culture, both Protestant and Roman Catholic, insofar as this doctrine influences the conceptions in the development of jurisprudence. Now let me resume with where we were in Financial Vipers of Venice. As we shall discover in this short excursus, the Western doctrine is intimately related to the notion of infinite debt that mankind supposedly owes God, and to the Western Church's interpretation of the sacrifice of Christ as a kind of infinite sacrifice balancing the divine account books. So now let's move on to our next slide. The easiest way to approach this complex subject in our theologically illiterate culture is to approach it from the standpoint of just one verse in the New Testament, a verse that is, so to speak, the formulation for the doctrine of original sin. That verse is Romans 5:12. In our exposition of this verse, it is important for the reader to remember that we are compacting centuries of analysis and theological interpretation, and thus the reader will have to learn a bit of theology and a little Greek and Latin along the way. We cite the verse here in the translation of the Authorized or King James Version for reasons that will become apparent shortly. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. Now, before we proceed with complex analysis, it should be noted that the verse does not say that sin nature or even guilt passed upon all men, but that death did. Now let's go to our next slide. Now let us begin to look at this verse, and particularly the last clause of the verse, for that all have sinned, very closely. In the original Greek, this reads Pho Pontus Imarton. Pardon me there, I didn't get the Greek put on the slide. And the two words that concern us here are Pho, or Pho to transliterate it, which the King James translators have very carefully, as we shall see, translated for that. The interesting thing about this little expression Pho is that it is capable of three different interpretations all at the same time. After all, this is Greek. These two little Greek words are, in the first instance, an idiomatic expression meaning simply because. Thus, the first meaning of the verse in the Greek is now this. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men because all have sinned. However, it is when we consider the meaning of the two Greek words Pho or Pho separately that the meaning becomes more specific. The second of these words, ho, is a masculine singular reflexive pronoun, referring, obviously, to a masculine singular antecedent in the previous parts of the sentence. The first word, F, is a preposition, which in this grammatical construction means for that reason or because of which. Notably, by adopting the translation for that, the King James translators were being scrupulously faithful in trying to preserve not only the first meaning, simply because, but also the other two possible meanings, because of which, or for that reason. So the question at this point becomes, what is the antecedent of the masculine singular pronoun, ho, or ho? In the previous parts of the verse, there are only two possibilities in the Greek, the one man, o anthropos, and death, o thanatos. If one takes the first antecedent, the one man, then the meaning of this verse becomes this. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, because of the one man all have sinned. But there is a problem with this reading, and many Greek church fathers saw it immediately. The problem is that in such constructions, the normal rules of grammatical exegesis infer that reflexive pronouns refer not to the farthest antecedent, but to the nearest, which in this case is not the one man, o anthropos, but death, o thanatos. Thus, the more specific reading of the verse is this, quote, "Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, and because of death all have sinned," unquote. Now, what this means is that on the first reading of the verse, "So death passed upon all men because all have sinned," is that death is a punishment for individual personal sin, whereas on the third reading of the verse, "So death passed upon all men, and because of death all have sinned," it is death, idem est, physical and spiritual corruption, that is passed from Adam and Eve to their descendants, but not the moral culpability for their sin. In other words, it is the consequence of their action, death, that is passed on, but not the moral responsibility for someone else's deeds. Indeed, it is largely the first and the third reading that the Greek Church Fathers favored, and hence there's no notion within Eastern Orthodoxy that one inherits a moral culpability for Adam and Eve, or a sin nature, as is often stated in Western versions of the doctrine. Now let me pause here and note what's happening with this interpretation that the Greek Church Fathers are giving this particular verse. Because you'll note that human nature is being rigorously distinguished from the individuals, in this case Adam and Eve, in question. For death is the consequence of their action, and that is what can be passed on in the common human nature. But the guilt and moral culpability, which is a personal act for their action, cannot be. Because, why? Because there's no confusion or definition of the person in terms of the functions of the human nature. It's that simple. And with that statement, we're now ready to tackle the other implications. Let me return to the financial vipers of Venice at this juncture. This close reading of the verse had enormous consequences for how the Eastern Church interprets other texts relating to this issue. And it also had enormous consequences for legal and cultural developments in the East, not the least of which was that within Orthodox cultures, it is not the crucifixion of Christ that is the central liturgical event, but the resurrection that is the central and liturgical and cultural event of Orthodox cultures. In other words, if I can stop right there, if you go to Orthodox cultures, the big feast day within their year isn't Christmas, and it isn't even Good Friday. It's rather the Pascha, the Passover, or in other words, Easter, the resurrection of Christ. Now, the reason, again, returning to financial vipers, is simple. The basic problem of mankind, on their view, is not so much a moral one, and hence not a problem of infinite debt, but, so to speak, a physical one that only God incarnate through the conquest of death can repair. Unquote. In other words, it's theoretically possible within Orthodox cultures to live a completely sinless life and nevertheless need a savior, because you're still going to croak, all right? I don't know how else to put it. It's just about that blunt. Now, let me pause here and go into another little bit of explanation before I resume with financial vipers on Venice, because we're going to see how these doctrines affect the way each Europe reads its primary texts. And this is very important, folks, because this means not only biblical texts, but as we're going to see, this doctrine will influence how the West begins to understand purely secular matters. Now, I plan to give one short example, but before I do that, I want to review what I also wrote in Financial Vipers about the Western doctrine of original sin and how that doctrine arose. Resuming then, note something very important here, for it will be crucial to understanding how the Western doctrine is, in fact, a doctrine of inherited guilt or moral culpability based on the doctrine of corporate personhood. In the Greek, death is indeed a natural consequence. That is to say, it inheres in the common human nature passed on from parent to child, and thus, on the Orthodox view, from Adam to Eve to the rest of humanity. But sin remains a personal choice, and hence the moral culpability is only ascribed to the individual person committing the act. Thus, a very clear distinction is drawn, as I noted before, between person and nature, a distinction that, as we shall now see, dissolves in the Western version of the doctrine. It is when we turn to the Latin Vulgate translation of St. Jerome that we see the origins of the Western doctrine that will become codified by St. Augustine of Hippo Regius. For here there is clearly an implied doctrine of corporate person. In the Vulgate, Romans 5:12 reads this way: "Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, in whom all have sinned." Now, the Latin of the last phrase is quite clear, emphatic, and insistent. En quo omnes peccaverunt, opting to be translated only and translating only the second possible meaning of the Greek epho pantos imarton, a reading that, as we saw, was not the favored reading of the Greek fathers, nor really even consonant with the normal rules of grammar. So now we must parse this reading somewhat, again compacting massive amounts of theological writings of the period and massive amounts of analysis. Our guide here will be the two crucial categories of person and nature, and the third metaphysical category so essential to theological dogmatics, the category of natural operation. We may get a glimmer of what each of these categories are designed to do by noting the questions that they are designed to answer. Number one, person answers the question, who is doing something? Number two, natural operation answers the question, what is it that they are doing? And thirdly, nature answers the question, what are they that they are doing these things? All right. Now you'll notice something here. I want to stop before we go any further. Notice the order of the questions: person, operation, nature. And this is the order of questions in which the church fathers actually ask questions. But if you study systematic theology in the West since Aquinas, if you look at Aquinas' Summa Contra Gentiles, his very first work of systematic theology, all the way down to the current era in Protestant and Roman Catholic theology, you'll notice that in their ordering of questions, they begin with the being and existence of God. Then they talk about attributes or natural operations, and finally they talk about persons. So in other words, the other thing that happened, and we don't have time to get into it here, but I'm just cluing you in to a huge thing that happened within Western theological culture, is that the order of asking questions was completely inverted, from beginning with the personal to beginning with, here it comes, the impersonal. Now let me continue with Financial Vipers of Venice. We can gain an appreciation of the second and third questions by the old adage, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, all natural operations of ducks, it's a duck. In other words, it possesses the common nature of duckdom. We get close to an understanding of the difference between person and nature here by noting that ordinary language maintains it. We say, I am a person, but I have a soul. And thus the rational faculties of human nature and soul are distinct from the person itself. As we shall see, it is customary for those in the West culture to make the mistake of identifying person with soul, and I've already talked about this initially in this little webinar, and thus to reduce the person to the soul's rational and volitional faculties for reasons that we shall get to shortly. Now, I'm skipping a couple paragraphs from Financial Vipers of Venice in order to get to the heart of the logic behind the Western doctrine of original sin or inherited guilt, all right? Let us return to the Western version of Romans 5:12 and parse what is going on in terms of the categories of person, natural operation, and nature to see what has happened. First, let's recall the reading of the Vulgate itself. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, in whom all have sinned. Now note the implied steps of the metaphysical logic here. Number one, the person of Adam, the one man of the verse, sins. Number two, sin is a personal use of the natural operation or exercise of the human will, which is a will itself. And thus, you're really ending up by confusing person and nature. You're really ending up defining the person by the use and its use of the natural faculties of human nature. So in other words, this is a huge reduction in a certain sense. And this reduction, if you stop and think about it, is going to have huge implications. And we're going to get to some of those, certainly not all of them, by the end of this little webinar. Now, number four, what this means is then that the natural operation of the will and its personal use now defines the content of all persons common to the inherited nature. So in other words, if you inherit that human nature with the misuse, personal misuse of the natural will, then you inherit the moral culpability, which of course, if you stop and think about it, is absurd. In other words, person has been confused with nature on the basis of one or several persons using their common faculty of will in the same or similar ways, and there's that corporate logic. This common functional use thus implicitly defines the very person itself, and consequently makes possible the conception of a group or corporate person conceived precisely in terms of the common functional use of the will. Now, it is this step which informs the corporate logic that so many people find so very frustrating, namely the formation of corporate groupthink cultures. Such a phenomenon is built into and an inherent component of the underlying corporate logic of the doctrine of original guilt. In other words, the distinction between person, operation, and nature has been completely blurred, and what has arisen as a consequence is a kind of group person. And indeed, you'll discover that if you research the topic, that some Protestant theologians would go so far as sometimes to call this a federal person, which is defined by the assumed common functions of the will and its involvement in a supposed universal guilt. Persons engaged in common functions, in this case sin, define the group or corporate person, in this case all of humanity descended from or in Adam, in whom all have sinned. It is this step that forms the theological basis of the doctrine of the corporate person in law. Now let me stop there, because we need to note something has happened. We need to ask why this doctrine founds the Western doctrine of corporate person. And the answer, again, is very obvious and very simple, but we have to say it in order to perceive what the significance is. What is indicated on any corporate charter? And the answer is the corporation, the legal person, is required to define what it does or is going to do. In other words, it is required to define itself by a certain select set of natural human operations it seeks to engage in. In other words, its personhood is being defined, just as in the doctrine of original guilt, is being defined functionally by the functions of human nature. So now, let's get to the fourth and I hope most significant part of this little webinar talk, because this is where the rubber meets the road. And folks, I have to tell you here that I could spend literally a 3-month-long honors philosophy or law seminar going into all the niceties of how this works out. So in other words, what I'm doing here again, folks, and I wish I had enormous amounts of time to make this webinar complete. What I'm doing here is compressing massive amounts of legal research that other scholars like Kantorowicz, that we'll be talking about shortly, or Maitland, or Bracton, or Sir Edward Coke, all of these very, very famous jurists and lawyers have done. I'm compacting a great deal of information here. But let's look first at some of the consequences of this. The first is that if you look at this doctrine carefully, what it is telling you is that the corporate person of Adam means that humanity has inbuilt systemic natural evil. Not, please note what I just said, natural evil. So in other words, if sin or evil is a group phenomenon induced in an individual person by dint of the common human nature, which all humans share, then in a certain sense, individuals are not only born guilty, but they're also absolved of individual responsibility for their actions, as in the phrase, it's just my what? Nature. On the flip side, however, evil itself has become systemic. And here it comes, folks. This is so huge, because you're going to see that these things are not simply new to the 19th or 20th century, but that they are actually part of the medieval culture. On the flip side, evil becomes systemic, requiring systemic solutions of ever larger and more central scale. Thus, one may trace the rise of globalist socialist solutions to systemic evil ultimately back to this doctrine. In order to address social injustice, one must impose a system on all of humanity. But the process begins not with Marx, but with Dante. Now, at this juncture, we are going to have to do a little bit of medieval studies, because it was the medievalist and scholar Ernst Kantorowicz in his monumental study, The King's Two Bodies, who observed this consequence working itself out in the political thought of the great Italian poet. Quote, man, or briefly, the totality of humanitas, could become actuated only by the collective effort of the corporate body of mankind. The fact that this perfection of the human totality was a desirable task, and even a necessary one, is a different matter. Dante's intent perhaps may be conveniently gathered from a stanza in the comedy. Quote, the human nature, when in its totality it sinned in its first seed, was parted both from its own dignities and from the paradise, unquote. That is, with regard to the original sin, the whole of mankind was like one body and one man, as Aquinas put it. Against that totality of mankind which fell guilty potentially in the first man, Dante set the totality of mankind which potentially can regain its own dignities and paradise as well. It can achieve by its own power and through the intellectual virtues its own actuation in the terrestrial paradise whence Adam had been expelled, unquote. And I'm citing Kantorowicz there on page 474. Now, please note what Kantorowicz has just told you. Read between the lines. Because if the problem is an inherited guilt via an original sin, and if this is a corporate guilt, then the way back to paradise is a corporate one that must perforce once again transform all of humanity into a corporation. In my opinion, therefore, it is this hidden theological impulse that lies at the very heart of the agenda of the globalists. And incidentally, it's also my opinion that they know this. Now, the second consequence is even more apparent. The corporate person and the confusion of the normative with the natural. Now, this takes us back to our theological Rorschach inkblot test. For the rise of the corporate group person also implies that the number of individuals who comprise any given corporate person, including, on the Western misreading of the doctrine, the corporation of all of humanity, define the norm of that nature. Thus, if most humans are capable of reason, choice, memory, and emotion, while some, the disabled, those in comas and so on, are not, then the norm can be twisted as a definition of the nature itself, and thus those individuals can be defined out of existence as subhuman. In other words, this doctrine is also ultimately at the heart behind any attempt to reduce any human being of any stage of development of life, of intellectual or moral capacity, or what have you. This is the logic behind any form of that type of racial genocide, all right? The normative, in other words, has been confused with the natural. And note, the implication here is that the positive definitive circumscriptions of the term nature are also failing, because you'll notice what's happening is human nature itself is being defined in terms of some of its normal functions, functions that may or may not be present to greater or lesser degrees depending on the individual. So again, we're square back to the real problem that ultimately confronted us with the topological metaphor and that no thing, because ultimately definitions do break down. They're dependent in the one case on analogical definitions, but within the theological culture of both East and West, it was always understood that these definitions are only approximations and never the full or complete truth. But now we live in a culture where these definitions are the truth. They've forgotten completely about the limitations of such analogical processes. So now let's get to a moral difficulty. And believe it or not, we're going to talk about Ayn Rand here. Because believe it or not, it was Ayn Rand who pointed out the difficulty of the doctrine of original sin in her celebrated novel, Atlas Shrugged. But being oblivious to the fact that this doctrine was not the doctrine of all of Christianity, she remained oblivious to its underpinning of her own beloved corporations, and therefore she remained oblivious to the possibility that corporations could also run amok and impose the same severe restraints on human liberty, creativity, and production on the basis of the same logic as that which underpins their existence in Western jurisprudence. That logic being the positive definition of personhood by confusing it with any set of operations of human nature. Here's what she said in the person of John Galt in his extended soliloquy toward the end of Atlas Shrugged. Damnation is at the start of your morality. Destruction is its purpose, means, and end. Your code begins by damning man as evil, then demands that he practice a good which it defines as impossible for him to practice. It demands, as his first proof of virtue, that he accept his own depravity without proof. It demands that he start not with a standard of value, but with a standard of evil, which is himself, by means of which he is then to define the good. The good is that which he is not. The name of this monstrous absurdity is original sin. A sin without volition is a slap at morality and an insolent contradiction in terms. That which is outside the possibility of choice is outside the province of morality. If a man is evil by birth, he has no will, no power to change it. If he has no will, he can be neither good nor evil. A robot is amoral. To hold a man's nature as his sin is a mockery of nature. To punish him for a crime he committed before he was born is a mockery of justice, unquote. And I'm citing the Signet Books paperback edition of Atlas Shrugged, and that will be found on page 938 of the 50th anniversary edition. Now, that brings us directly and squarely to the final and most crucial part of this little webinar, the political and cultural consequences. And here again, folks, I am tremendously skipping over a great deal of stuff. Because the juridical and political consequences of this doctrinal complex, which we might call the original sin corporate personhood conceptual complex, because obviously the presuppositions that one brings to a text will affect the way one understands it, whether that text be biblical or some other type of text, such as a legal text. Now consider how each of the two understandings, the Western and Eastern doctrines of what you inherit from Adam, would interpret this verse of the New Testament book of Ephesians, verse 2, or chapter 2, verse 3, for example. Among whom we also had our conversation in times past in the lusts of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature the children of wrath, even as others. Now, I'm going to leave it to you to figure out how each cultural tradition would look at and interpret that verse. I'm going to suggest to you that obviously the Western interpretation of it is going to be very, very severe and harsh, whereas the Eastern interpretation of it, once you understand it, is going to be much, much less so. But let's get right down to brass tacks. We earlier hinted at Dante's political conceptions and how humanity had lost its dignities due to the Western conception of original sin. Now stop and think for a moment. Dignities is, of course, a political term of art at that time, referring to the dignities, idem est, the authority and powers of kings, dukes, counts, barons, bishops, emperors, and of course popes. Thus, whether the doctrine is true or not in any of its forms, it nonetheless is huge with political significance. Dante, of course, transmuted the doctrine into a doctrine, and please pay attention here, into a doctrine of corporate action to regain, to the extent possible, the lost paradisial dignities of man. Dante, however, was merely expressing one consequence of the doctrine of inherited guilt as he had learned it from Aquinas. So once again, I'm going to go to Ernst Kantorowicz and his book, The King's Two Bodies. Here's what Kantorowicz says. Aquinas, too, advanced a corporational explanation of the guilt of mankind. We may say that all men born from Adam can be considered as one man, possunt considerare ut unus homo, insofar as they concur in the nature which they received from the first man, just as in civil affairs all men of a community are imputed, so to say, as one body, and the whole community as one man, unquote. Now note, what Aquinas has done is to import the doctrine into political jurisprudence. For now the community becomes the one man or a corporation soul, and this has dramatic consequences for the medieval conception of kingship and the ultimate emergence of the distinction between the king as an individual human person and the crown as the corporate person of kingship. So close are the associations between this theological doctrine and the developing political and jurisprudential reflection on what we would now call constitutional law, that the medieval jurist Accursius, in response to a question as to whether lawyers should study theology, answered no, going on to state that all of theology was contained in the law anyway. And you'll find that reference in Kantorowicz once again on page 123. Now, by the time of Henri de Bracton's, and he lived from 1210 to 1268, legal commentaries in England, the distinction between the rex regnans, or the actual ruling human king or person, and the crown as the corporate office of CEO of the realm was already common usage, but it carried a crucial implication. Bracton wrote this, quote, "A thing quasi-sacred is a thing fiscal, which cannot be given away or sold or transferred upon one other person by the prince or ruling king, the rex regnans, and those things make the crown what it is, and they regard to common utility, such as peace and justice, unquote. And that again is from Kantorowicz, page 173. And please note I've added the emphasis here, because you'll notice now that the thing fiscal belongs to the crown. It belongs to the corporation's soul. It belongs, therefore, to whoever occupies the corporate CEO office as prince or, quote, rex regnans, the ruling king. So in other words, the royal fisc, or what we would today call the financial power, was an inherent power, not of the individual, nor even of the individual rex regnans, but it's rather now an impersonal, inherent power of the corporation's soul of the crown. Now, this too has enormous consequence, for we need always to remember that the context of legal thinking here, like it or not, was and remains rooted in Christian conceptions, and more specifically, those of Western and not Eastern Europe. As such, the matrix in which thought is forming is always of the movement between Adam and Christ, both exemplars of a corporation's soul. And let us not forget for a moment that Aquinas would use corporate language to describe the church. And remember the implication now, because what was Dante saying? Dante was saying, in order to regain our lost paradisial dignities, humanity, all of humanity, would have to be brought into a corporation and act in a certain functional way in order to do so. So in other words, it is this universal corporation, this corporation's soul, which is the church, that lies behind the papal claims, for example, of a Boniface VIII in the bull Unum Sanctum, where he says very explicitly, it is altogether necessary for every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff. And please note his words there, subject to, not in communion with. All right? So in other words, the logic is, again, entirely corporate, and it's also a logic compelling to obedience to a corporate group culture. All of this, in turn, means that while an individual rex regnans could not give away the power of the crown pertaining to the royal fisc, he could delegate legal agents or representatives and potentially their successors to administer it. So in other words, also arising as a consequence of all of this is a bureaucracy, an impersonal bureaucracy in a corporate group culture that proceeds, so to speak, out of its policy manuals. And these policy manuals are specifically described and prescribed to perform certain functions that define the corporation. In this case, the royal fisc, financial or fiscal policy. All right. This is therefore the ultimate logic that leads to the formation by William III of Orange of the Bank of England in 1694. So now, the reason I've gone at galloping speed through all of this, skipping massive amounts of details and dots to connect, is because we're hearing a lot, and I certainly subscribe to the idea that what we need to do is rethink the doctrine of the corporate person, and I agree. But what I'm hoping that you'll take from this little talk, this little first webinar, is enough of an indicator of how deeply ingrained such conceptions are in our culture, and how carefully that rethinking will need to be done. Because if we go in willy-nilly and say that we've got to get rid of corporations altogether, we're going to run into a large problem. Our legal system has, to a certain extent, already called into question the doctrine on which all of this is based. Babies are born every day, already addicted to drugs, and in this sense bearing the sins of their fathers in their nature that they inherit from them. But no one assumes for a moment that they are guilty of drug addiction, nor no one assumes for a moment that they are morally or legally culpable for it. So I'm bold to suggest that if we carefully and deeply probe the logic of the position, that a way will be discovered to curb current corporate excesses without undue damage to the idea of a corporation itself. But we are going to have to think carefully and deeply about it to see how and why. And that's it, folks, for our first little webinar. I hope that you have enjoyed this, and I hope that everything worked, that I got all of the slides up on this thing. If not, I may have to redo this. Anyway, that's it for now, everybody. Bye-bye.